Hi there. So just getting ready. Um, Let me see. Okay, I always find it a bit distracting because I've got the screen on, so I'll turn that off. Okay, so hope you're all well. So I see a few of you on there, Rupert Chitter and Ellie. Hi. Um, Ellie, I saw your drawings on Instagram, so that's really good. Yeah, very nice. Good to see you doing some work. Um, and let me know in the comments. I'll check them at the end. But if you do want to join the Zoom meeting, you just need the link, and I think I might have sent that out before. But if you haven't got it, I will. I'll get that across to you. So, okay. Um, So yeah, I hope you're all well. Yeah, I've been up at my studio again, doing a bit of sorting out there, and just trying to do a little bit more work on my YouTube channel. I'm just sort of thinking about the format of these videos and what works best. I think people are enjoying the weekly sort of structure, so that's good. So we'll carry on with that. But yeah, there's other things like whether to carry on with the live streaming or not. So obviously, if I can edit it, it might be a bit more sort of smoother and perhaps not quite so rambling. So, but this is it, all sort of part of the journey. So let's have a talk about today. So we're going to be doing scale. Let's see, make sure this works. Scale. And so this is, as you know, part of our ongoing theme of uh, volume, scale, overlap. Oh, sorry, that's off. That's off, isn't it? Okay. Scale. Okay. Volume, scale, overlap, and perspective. So my intention with this has been basically for you to sort of memorize these concepts and just get a little bit of a feel for them. And then hopefully they're going to serve you in the long run. Primarily, I think they help you for coming up with good ideas, good designs, good viewpoints. Um, and I think what we've seen so far is you can, just on this basis alone, you can make quite good images. And they all basically contribute together. They work together to reinforce a sense of reality and hopefully sort of depth. So that's what we're interested in. So I will go through, we'll talk a little bit about scale, and then at the end I'll give you this week's lesson. Okay. So first thing first, let's just move that. Okay, is we're going to talk about scale in relation to your artwork. So I was just thinking about scale and some of the different ways you can sort of think about it. And one thing it's worth thinking about maybe is varying the scale of the actual artworks that you produce. Okay, so um, say the term just gone, I was concentrating on working at quite a small scale, and that gives you certain challenges. But at the same time, people seem to quite like that smaller, the 6 inch by 6 inch format. Um, but at the same time, it's quite useful to every now and again attempt bigger canvases. Okay, and you'll find that it brings up different challenges. So it's not always easier, but again, it very much changes the way you relate to the artwork. Okay, so when I was at college, there was a great most people were working big, and that was very much the thing. But you know, I wasn't quite so much into those bigger paintings, and sort of since I've been painting outdoors and working from life, I tend to work quite small. But they say you should always try and perhaps have a bigger painting on the go. And often what happens with these bigger paintings is it gives you problems which you have to work through, but it's the working through these problems that actually makes you in the long run a better artist. So think about that this week. Maybe vary the scale. So it might even just be working in a smaller. Um, you can work in these very small little sketchbooks, but you can do a lot more drawing. So you could just try working a bit smaller and try and do more. Or say if you feel inspired, you could try and attempt a bigger painting at the end of this week. Okay, so that's scale in terms of your artwork. Now let's see. We'll just adjust that slightly. So then we get on to this thing about the objects. And we're thinking here primarily about scale in relation to the canvas, okay? So let's give you some examples here. So the first one, okay, is where you take an object and you make it basically, let's do some sort of apple. Okay, so you basically make it mostly that object. And that creates a very dramatic sort of composition. Okay, so that's where you have a large object in relation to your background. So it's almost, let's say, it's like 80% object and 20% background. Okay, so that's one approach. Then you can go for this idea. Something where it's more, let's say, 50-50. Okay, so I've set it off to the side there. So this is more 50-50. So this is probably the default sort of scale that most people will work to. Okay. And then you can also, I haven't tried too many of these myself, but you can have one where what you do is basically the objects become quite small. Let's say, for example, we have something like that. There's our apple. Something like that. And then we might have more details in the room. Okay, you might even have other objects. So this is more like 20% object or less than that, and 80% background. So this is basically what I would call, this one is like the close-up, okay? So you're really sort of getting in at the action. And for doing individual still life objects, this is a really nice composition. You can use bright, colourful backgrounds, but say you mainly make it all about the object. This one, as I say, this is probably the more default one where it's, and that's probably not a good thing. Normally 50-50, you want more, I mean, this isn't quite 50-50. but you want some tension between the background and the object itself. And then this one, this sort of still life arrangement might involve other objects, things on the table, okay? But it becomes less about just the objects like this one, and it becomes more about the context. So if you have a room or a situation, you're sort of drawing more of that in, okay? So so the scale of the object is often something that people perhaps don't consider, but once you've identified something that you want to have a go at, this should be something, this should be part of your working process. So these little things here, these are what I would call thumbnail sketches, and they're a really useful thing to try and do when you're planning your work, okay, and just thinking about these things. Okay, so that's scale there. Right. So now we can think about our main sort of gist, which is creating a feeling of depth. Scale and depth. So if you remember, what I was saying here is our main sort of concern is this trying to create the illusion of the three-dimensional world in a two-dimensional surface. Okay, so if we start off here. Okay, so if we have three objects, let's to make it simple, I will put this on, put them on a sort of flat surface, maybe a shelf. So when you have three objects that are the same, if we keep them the same size, it just suggests that they are basically on the same plane. They're neither forward or backward, okay? So something like that. And then now this works more effectively, as say initially when you think about the same object, okay, because we can then judge them in relationship. So if we now have them on the shelf and we have, let's say we've got one big one there, smaller one there, another one there. Okay, so that will, obviously that's perhaps quite an extreme jump there, but that will suggest this one being further away, okay? You'll more easily perhaps get it with, if I do this, if we introduce, so I've done it on the shelf, which makes it easier. What I'm trying to do is not do them all simultaneously, volume and perspective, or scale and perspective. But if I introduce, let's say 1, 2, 3, then we easily get a sense that between these is depth, okay? Because our eye sort of assumes it's the same object. So that's the principle. And you will also see it, next week I'll do perspective, but just as a little sort of primer there. So there's our horizon, okay? So the sort of classic one is telegraph poles or something like that. 1, 2. Okay, so you get your telegraph poles, and because our brain understands them as all being basically the same object, the same size object, by diminishing the scale in the picture, we're going to create a sense of depth and distance. Okay. You also see it perhaps with train tracks. Okay. Big, to small. So those are some examples. Let's have a look. Other things we might look at. So trees. Now, as I say, I'm trying to do all these without the overlaps. Once you introduce the overlaps and the tonal values, okay, all these things contribute together. So let's say we've got a tree. A tree here. And then a small tree in the distance. Okay, so by using these sorts of ideas, we can create this feeling of depth. Now, in some respects, it's perhaps more apparent with landscape because you're using these great big distances. But I think it does work well in still life. So what I would suggest for sort of playing around with this is initially try to use the same object. And what you want to do is you want to get your eye level down so that you, instead of having a narrow shelf, you create perhaps a sort of longer depth of field. So let's say we've got a table, and this table goes off into the distance like that. So this is using perspective. Then I've got more opportunity to play around with scale. Okay, so and then if you also introduce the overlap, okay, you're going to be able to create this strong feeling that this is a three-dimensional space with smaller things in the distance and bigger things in the foreground. Okay, so that's it there. It's probably just worth saying this sort of goes back a bit to what I was saying about scale. Scale's a good thing to look for. This thing about sort of large and small objects. So when you're coming up with compositions, a couple of things you'll see landscape artists do is let's say, for example, you've got a sort of landscape. So you put a large tree in the foreground. Okay, there's your tree, something like that. So large, and then a small thing in the distance. So I would actually call this, so this is a compositional idea, and you could think of it as big versus small. Okay, other ideas might be, you'll see this one a lot. So you've got your church or something in the distance. Then you've got a hedgerow in the foreground. Okay, and then what you do is you make some of the flowers, okay, bigger than the church. Something like that. Actually, Rupert Chitter, I think I saw your drawing of the daffodils, which was something very similar to this, which again, you take an object, maybe an interior object, and you make that big, okay, and then you look at something, and it helps to give the feeling that these things are off in the distance, okay. So these are good ideas to play with in terms of your composition. And as I say, with still life, you might be thinking more about interiors, and you're trying to find viewpoints. This idea where you're looking through at your focal point. So you're using a big foreground object to look through to a smaller, distant object like that. Okay. And once you start to look for it, you'll see this device used in all sorts of situations. So like films, let's have a look. Films, you'll see things like this. Big face. Okay. Let's no. So you've got a big face there, big person, and then maybe a small person walking in the distance. Okay, big versus small. Or another one. Big person, maybe a small boat in the distance. Okay, so you can use it. Look, one of the things to do is to look for it. Look for it in films, television, that sort of thing, and you'll sort of start to see it everywhere. Big versus small. So it's a using scale really as a compositional device, and it's quite a fun thing to play with and see to what extreme you can sort of push that. Okay. Another idea that I wanted to suggest to you was thinking in terms of foreground, middle ground, and background. So again, this is just a helpful way to think. So let's say you're doing your still life. Okay, let me see that. Okay. Now, again, sometimes these rules, you know, they're there to be broken and they're not sort of set in stone, but it's just quite useful to be aware of them as ideas. So often what artists will do is they will locate their focal point or their subject of interest in the middle ground. Okay. So if we use the example of a still life, so you see what can happen with the still life when we use the example of the, oh no, we can't, if I put this here. So if we do the big fruit like we talked about, okay, the thing with this is there's very little foreground, so it's not very easy to find your way in. Whereas if we have a middle ground here, say, now let's say I put my, let's say we put a pepper, and that's what we find interesting. So this gives us this space here, which can act like our foreground. And one of the ways you can think of the foreground is you can use it as a way to set up scale, but also you try to find devices to lead your eye in. So for example, let's imagine this is on a table and we've got a tablecloth, okay, over here, something like that. Or sometimes you see in still lives they'll have a spoon or a fork or something breaking this. So devices that pull your eye in, okay? With landscape, or it might even be something like an overlapping form, say for example like a chair, the back of a chair or something like that. So your foreground is there as a device to lead your eye into where your interest is. So you try not to make the objects in the foreground too interesting. So I think Phil, um, his recent watercolor painting is he had these sort of planters in the foreground, and they're fine, but if there's too much light around them or too much contrast, they become too interesting, and you want your interest, remember, to be here. Okay, so foreground, middle ground, this is where your interest is and your lights normally, and then something in the background. So again, in still life, you might use a bit of cloth or a compositional device to lead your eye in, or you might have some sort of pattern or something like that. Okay, in sort of landscape, you're going to have often like a way in, maybe a path or something like that. Then in the middle ground, you're going to have your interest. What can we see? I'll put a church, something like that. And then background, you're going to have perhaps smaller things. If it was a different part of the world, you might have mountains or something like that. But yeah, you think in those terms, and then I say you think in those terms, whatever you're doing, you're trying to think with that sense of foreground, middle ground, distance. Okay, so so have a think about that and see if you can incorporate this in either a still life or a sort of landscape composition. Okay, and then lastly, let's have a look. You're trying to find situations to use this all together. So we've got so far volume, scale, overlap. Okay, so let's imagine, I'll try and sort of come up with a few sort of compositional ideas here. So let's say if I look down where I'm on Spring Road in Ipswich, sort of around there. So let's say I was doing the viaduct. So the viaduct becomes my middle ground. Okay, that would be my main interest. Now, it's going to have some perspective in there. So ways I can introduce scale is, for example, maybe have a car. Okay, there's a sort of car shape, and then smaller cars under the viaduct going off into the distance. Okay, overlap. Well, I can have forms overlapping this viaduct here. I can also have the viaduct itself overlapping forms in the distance. I can have overlapping forms with the houses behind. Okay, and then I could also introduce volume, give these things a shadow. This is going to be perhaps in shadow here. And then introduce other ways of these little cast shadows. Okay, so you're looking for situations where you can sort of try and tie all these together. Okay, still life. So instead of perhaps the normal still life, perhaps have, let's say, going back to the pepper, maybe we have a really large foreground pepper like that. Okay, then you've got another pepper here. So that's overlap, maybe with some more shadow. And then maybe even in the distance you could have a couple more to suggest, let's say there's a table. Okay, so there you've got, and you might even, maybe you could even introduce, like, let's say you've got a window or an interior. So then you've got your foreground, middle ground, and distance. Okay, so that's really what I'm after. That's what I want you to try and have a go at, is to find a way to sort of link all these together. And I say we can't really get out, but sorts of things I can see. Just if I look out my window, I can see something like this. Let's see. So I've got a bird feeder. Okay, and actually it's got one of those squirrel proof. So let's say I got the bird feeder, okay, and imagine, let's try and do a little, something like that. There's a little bird, okay, looks more like a large bee, but there we go, flapping around. So that would be my foreground object. So although that's quite interesting, so maybe that'd be better for my middle ground. So perhaps before that I could have like my other bird feeder, something like this. Okay, bigger object like that. And then to create depth, what I've got behind that is I can see trees, okay, and maybe even the neighbour's house. Small windows, okay. So then basically you have the bird, maybe the composition could be more like that. The bird becomes like big in relation to these small windows. So you have what's effectively a small object reading against this far off distant object. And so by doing that, you can create these incredible sort of feelings of depth and space, okay? Another one I quite like, let's see, we'll do one here. So in landscape painting, they had this idea of the sublime, which is you basically have a very big landscape. Let's say we've got great big clouds, okay, and sort of stormy. So you create a feeling of immense sort of space using perspective, and there's our clouds in the distance. Okay, so big landscape, and then let's say here's a boat. Sort of thing I would see around here. So I like this sort of thing. This is where you have a small thing. This is the small versus big again. Big landscape with a small little detail. Could be a person, a boat, or something like that. And this to me evokes this idea of the sublime, which is this feeling of nature being sort of vast and somehow it's not unpleasant, but it's a bit sort of like, you know, the individual is somehow dwarfed by its surroundings. So it's a you know, it's a dramatic feeling of nature, as opposed to nature just being sort of very pleasant to be in. You know, it's got sort of different moods, and some of them aren't always, they're not pleasant, or they can be sort of like big storms and that sort of thing. So yeah, I quite like that. And again, I'm sure there would be a sort of a still life equivalent if you wanted to find something like that. Okay, so let's just clarify what I'm going to ask you to do. Okay, so first one is, let's see, this week's. So, first one is I want you to find some sort of composition or arrangement where you play with scale with the same objects. I mean by that like a pair of objects. So one of the ones that's come into mind there is Phil's one with the his drawing of a chair. So a chair would be quite a good one. So let's say you've got a chair here. Okay, chair and then same chair. Okay, but this one is going to be smaller like that, you see, because it's in the distance. So same object, but creating depth. So we get a sense of depth that way, okay? If you try something like this, pay particular attention to the position of the legs of the chairs, because that's sort of suggesting perspective and depth as well. So that would be something to focus on in particular. So same objects, but played against each other. And then I think I'll just give you, so you could play around with that in lots of different variations. And then secondly, your still life painting. So I want you to deliberately create a sense of the foreground, middle ground, and background. And I want you to put your attention on, our interest is on the middle ground. But that doesn't mean these are going to be left empty. So I want you to play with those and try to create this feeling of depth, where you might have been working with a more shallower depth of field. And that's what I'll try and do my demonstration on as well, something like that, some arrangement. So, and remember this idea that you're trying to basically pull the eye from your foreground into your middle ground, and then the background also helps to provide sort of scale and context. So play around with those elements. And yeah, I think that would be enough to be getting on with. If you want, you could also try and if you can get some, maybe you've got some photographs from holidays and stuff like that. If you can see other ones that exploit this idea or might give you a good way to play with this in a landscape format, then that would be great as well. So because again, this idea of scale, it's useful in all sorts of situations to create depth. Okay. So thanks for that. If you have any questions, let me know. And for some of you, I'll be seeing you in the tutorial in, we'll say 11 o'clock. I'll be in the Zoom tutorial. Okay, so thanks a lot for that, and I'll see you soon. Cheers. Bye.